On a cold, rainy night, a U.S. Marine on night security patrol and his canine discovered two terrified twin girls with nowhere left to go. They weren't lost. They were hiding, afraid of being found, afraid of being separated. He was doing his job. Helping was expected. But what he found that night went beyond any protocol or checklist. What followed forced him to face his past, his limits, and a responsibility he was never ordered to take. Stay until the end, because sometimes a miracle, maybe even God's work, begins when duty ends and choice begins. Cold rain swept through Grey Haven, Oregon, driven sideways by sharp wind rolling down from the surrounding forest, turning the town into a blur of wet asphalt, rusted steel, and trembling yellow streetlights. Staff Sergeant Daniel Cole walked through the abandoned freight district with slow, deliberate steps. He was a former U.S. Marine, tall, solidly built, dark hair cut short, a trimmed beard shadowing a face that rarely showed emotion. Years of service had taught him to move quietly, to observe before acting, and to keep his thoughts locked behind a calm exterior. Since leaving the Marines 2 years earlier, Daniel had learned to live with silence, preferring it to conversations that drifted too close to memories he didn't want to revisit. At his side moved Rex, a retired military canine with black and amber fur and a steady, disciplined gait. Rex was 7 years old, still strong but slower than in his prime, his amber eyes constantly reading the environment. The dog had served alongside Daniel during his final deployment, and when Daniel was discharged, Rex had come home with him. They functioned as a unit without needing words. Daniel worked night security now, taking contracts that kept him away from crowds, industrial zones, closed rail yards, forgotten properties on the edge of town. The work paid modestly, but it gave him structure, something to focus on when sleep refused to come. Night suited him. Darkness didn't demand explanations. Rainwater streamed down the sides of rusted shipping containers as Daniel and Rex moved deeper into the yard near the old railway spur. The place had been abandoned for years, but recent reports of trespassing had brought Daniel here tonight. His knee ached with each step, a dull reminder of the injury that had ended his military career. But he ignored it, as he always did. Rex stopped. Daniel froze instantly, his body reacting before his mind fully caught up. He raised one hand slightly, palm down. Rex's posture had changed, muscles tight, tail lowered, ears angled forward. Not fear, focus. "What is it?" Daniel murmured. Rex didn't bark. He never barked when something mattered. Instead, he moved forward slowly, nose close to the ground, tracking a scent that didn't belong in a place this empty. Daniel followed, senses sharpening as the rain muffled distant sounds. Then Daniel caught it too. Human, faint, small. They stopped in front of a shipping container whose doors hung unevenly open, rust eating through the hinges. Darkness filled the space inside, heavy and still. "Hello?" Daniel called, keeping his voice calm and even. No answer. A second later, he heard it, a soft, uneven breath, barely audible beneath the rain. Daniel stepped closer and crouched, angling his flashlight into the container. The beam cut through the darkness and revealed two small figures huddled against the metal wall, wrapped tightly around each other for warmth. Their clothes were thin and soaked through, their bodies trembling uncontrollably. They were twin girls, no older than 6. One of them reacted immediately, shifting forward so her small body formed a shield in front of the other. Her dark hair clung to her face, rain and dirt streaking her cheeks. Her lips trembled, but her eyes stayed fixed on Daniel with a determination that felt painfully out of place on such a young face. The second girl stayed half hidden behind her sister, fingers gripping fabric tightly, her gaze flicking between Daniel and Rex with raw, unfiltered fear. Daniel felt his chest tighten. "It's okay," he said quietly, lowering himself further so he wasn't looming over them. "You're not in trouble." Rex moved forward on his own, stopping just inside the container before lowering himself to the floor. He turned his body slightly sideways, his posture loose and non-threatening, exactly as he had been trained to do around civilians in distress. The quieter twin noticed him immediately. Her breathing slowed, though her body still shook. She reached out with one small tentative hand and touched Rex's fur, her fingers curling into it as if she were holding on to something solid in a world that had suddenly become unstable. Rex didn't move. "My name's Daniel," he said gently. "What are your names?" The girl in front hesitated, swallowing hard. "Emma," she said. Her voice was hoarse but steady. "This is Grace." Grace didn't speak. She leaned closer to Rex instead, pressing her forehead into his neck. The dog responded by shifting slightly, offering more warmth without crowding her. Daniel slipped off his jacket and wrapped it around both girls. They disappeared inside it, swallowed by the heavy fabric. Emma stiffened at first, watching him carefully, then relaxed when he stepped back instead of closer. "How long have you been here?" Daniel asked. Emma shrugged, eyes flicking toward the container door. "Since it got dark?" Grace tightened her grip on Rex's fur. Daniel exhaled slowly. He scanned the surrounding yard again, instinctively checking for movement, for anyone else who might step out of the rain. There was nothing, just rusted metal, shadows, and the relentless sound of water hitting steel. This wasn't a miracle. There were no signs, no sense of destiny, just two children who had run out of places to hide. Daniel's mind shifted into a familiar mode, cataloging next steps the way he used to in the field. Call it procedure, call it survival. But beneath that practiced calm, something else stirred, something heavier. He had walked past plenty of problems in his life, convinced himself they weren't his responsibility. Tonight felt different. Rex looked up at him, amber eyes steady, waiting. Daniel met that gaze and felt something move deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt since the day he folded his uniform and placed it in a box he never opened again. A sense of duty, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the fog he'd lived in since leaving the Corps. He helped Emma and Grace to their feet, moving slowly so he wouldn't scare them. Emma kept herself between Daniel and her sister, even as she followed his lead. Grace stayed close to Rex, one small hand still buried in his fur. As they stepped out of the container, the rain hit them harder, cold and relentless. Daniel guided them toward the faint glow of his truck's headlights parked at the edge of the yard. The girls moved hesitantly, their steps unsure, as if afraid the ground might disappear beneath them. Daniel opened the passenger door and helped them inside, turning the heater on full. Warm air filled the cab, fogging the windows almost instantly. Emma let out a small, involuntary sound of relief she quickly tried to hide. Grace curled inward, her body still tense but no longer shaking as violently. Rex jumped into the back seat without being told and settled immediately, positioning himself so the girls could see him through the gap between the seats. Daniel closed the door and stood there for a moment, rain soaking through his clothes. He rested one hand on the roof of the truck, breathing slowly, grounding himself. He knew what protocol said. Call it in, transfer responsibility, let the system take over. He also knew the system didn't always catch what fell through its cracks. Daniel slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As the truck pulled away from the abandoned freight yard, the container disappeared into the darkness behind them, just another piece of forgotten metal swallowed by rain. But Daniel knew that what he had found inside it would not be so easily left behind. This night was over, and whatever came next would demand more from him than he had planned to give. The County Child Support Center sat on the edge of Greyhaven like an afterthought, a low concrete building with tired windows and fluorescent lights that hummed softly even at night. Rain followed Daniel Cole inside as he pushed through the glass doors, the smell of wet fabric and cold air lingering behind him. Emma and Grace walked close, their small steps uneven, Emma slightly ahead, Grace half hidden behind Rex's broad frame. Rex stayed calm and alert, moving at their pace, his presence steady in a space that felt unfamiliar and overwhelming. The waiting room was quiet, almost too quiet. Plastic chairs lined the walls, and a faded mural of cartoon animals tried unsuccessfully to soften the sterile atmosphere. Emma sat upright, feet dangling, her hands folded tightly in her lap as if she were afraid to take up too much space. Grace sat on the floor instead, leaning against Rex's side, her fingers gripping his fur with quiet determination. She had not spoken since they left the freight yard, and Daniel noticed how her breathing slowed only when Rex was close enough for her to feel his warmth. A woman stepped out from behind a narrow hallway and paused when she saw them. Her name was Sarah Whitmore, a senior caseworker with the county, and the exhaustion showed in the subtle slump of her shoulders. She was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with light brown hair pulled back into a loose bun that had begun to unravel by the end of her shift. Fine lines framed her eyes and mouth, not from age alone, but from years of listening to stories that rarely had clean endings. Her skin was pale, her movements careful but efficient, and her voice carried a practiced gentleness that came from experience rather than sentimentality. "Mr. Cole?" she asked, glancing down at the intake clipboard in her hand. Daniel nodded once. "That's me." Her eyes flicked briefly to the girls, then to Rex, and something in her expression softened. "You can come with me." They followed her down a narrow hallway into a small interview room. The space held a table, 4 mismatched chairs, and a box of tissues placed deliberately within reach. Sarah gestured for them to sit. Emma climbed into a chair, still alert, while Grace remained close to Rex, lowering herself onto the floor again. Sarah noticed but didn't comment. She had learned long ago that forcing children to behave normally rarely helped. "I'm Sarah," she said, lowering herself into the chair across from Daniel. "I work with the county. I know tonight's been a lot." Daniel said nothing. He had learned that silence often encouraged people to talk more freely. Sarah opened a file, scanning the pages. "The girls' names are Emma and Grace Miller. They're 6. They were reported missing by a neighbor 2 days ago, but the report didn't go far. Their mother never filed anything officially." Emma's head snapped up. "Mom told us not to talk to anyone," she said quickly, her voice sharp with urgency. "She said it was safer if we waited." Daniel felt a subtle shift beside him as Rex adjusted his position, sensing the change in the room. Sarah nodded slowly, her expression calm. "That makes sense," she said. "Do you know where your mom went, Emma?" Emma hesitated, her mouth opening, then closing again. Her shoulders lifted slightly, as if bracing herself. "She said we had to hide," she replied. "Just for a little while." Grace pressed closer to Rex. Sarah made a note, her pen moving quietly. "Did she say why?" Emma's voice dropped. "Because of Dad." The word landed heavily in the small room. Daniel leaned back slightly, keeping his expression neutral, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sarah didn't react outwardly. "Do you remember what she said about your dad?" Emma shook her head once. "She just said he was angry, and that he wasn't supposed to find us." Grace let out a small sound then, barely more than a breath. Sarah's gaze shifted toward her, softening further. "Grace," she said gently, "you don't have to talk if you don't want to." Grace didn't look up, but her fingers tightened in Rex's fur. Sarah leaned back, folding her hands together. "We've had previous calls related to the household," she said, turning back to Daniel. "Noise complaints, welfare checks. Nothing that resulted in charges. No open warrants that we can see." Daniel nodded once. He'd heard variations of this before. Situations that hovered just below the line where the system could act. "What about the mother?" he asked. Sarah exhaled quietly. "Her name is Lena Miller, early 30s, petite build, dark hair, worked part-time at a grocery store on the south end of town. She left work 3 days ago and never returned. Her phone goes straight to voicemail, no credit card activity since." Daniel absorbed the information without comment. "We don't know what happened to her," Sarah continued. "We don't know if she left voluntarily or if something else occurred." Emma's hands clenched in her lap. "She said she'd come back," she whispered. Grace leaned her forehead into Rex's side, her shoulders trembling slightly. Sarah closed the file. "For tonight, the girls will stay under county care," she said carefully. "Normally, they'd be placed in an emergency foster home." Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He glanced toward Emma and Grace. Emma's posture stiffened instantly, her eyes darting toward her sister. "But," Sarah added, her gaze flicking briefly to Rex, "there are Considerations. She leaned forward slightly. The girls show a strong attachment to each other and to the dog. Separating them tonight could make things worse. Daniel studied her face. He could see the calculation there, the careful weighing of policy against reality. For now, Sarah said, they'll be placed in a temporary observation room here. You're welcome to stay until they fall asleep. Daniel nodded once. I'll stay. The observation room was small but warm, with 2 cots pushed together and a thin blanket laid across them. Emma climbed onto one of the cots immediately, keeping her back straight. Grace hesitated, then climbed up beside her, still close enough to Rex to reach him. Rex lay down at the foot of the cots without being told, positioning himself so both girls were within reach. Daniel stood nearby, arms crossed loosely, watching. Minutes passed. The rain continued outside, tapping against the window in a steady rhythm. Emma's breathing slowed first, her determined posture gradually softening. Grace's grip on Rex loosened just enough for sleep to take hold. Sarah observed quietly from the doorway. They only calm down when they're together, she said softly, and when the dog is near. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He was watching the girls, noting how Emma's hand rested protectively near Grace's shoulder even in sleep. I didn't plan on this, he said finally. Sarah nodded. Most people don't. Daniel straightened, meeting her gaze. I'm not trying to fix anything, I just found them. Sarah studied him for a long moment. She had seen men like him before, quiet, contained, carrying weight they rarely spoke about. Finding them changes things, she said. Daniel looked back at the girls. He had walked away from a lot in his life, convinced himself it was the only way to survive. But as he watched Emma and Grace sleep, Rex standing silent guard, he understood something with unsettling clarity. This wasn't a problem he could hand off and forget. Not anymore. Morning light filtered weakly through the narrow windows of the county evaluation wing, turning the pale walls a dull gray that felt neither welcoming nor cold. Just functional. Daniel Cole sat in a hardback chair outside the assessment rooms, his posture straight out of habit rather than comfort. Hands folded loosely, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Rex lay at his feet, head up, alert but calm, the same way he used to wait outside briefing rooms overseas. The building smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee, and the hum of ventilation filled the spaces between distant footsteps. Emma emerged first, escorted by a woman in her mid-30s with a calm, professional gait. The psychologist's name was Dr. Hannah Brooks, a clinical child specialist contracted by the county. She was of average height, slender, with short, dark blonde hair tucked neatly behind her ears and glasses that slipped slightly down her nose when she focused too intently. Her skin was pale, almost translucent under the fluorescent lights, and her voice carried a quiet authority shaped by years of listening more than speaking. Emma walked beside her, chin lifted, shoulders squared, her small hands clenched tightly at her sides. Grace followed several minutes later with a different specialist, Dr. Miguel Alvarez, a trauma-focused clinician in his early 40s. He had a solid build, olive-toned skin, and a neatly trimmed beard framing a face that rarely showed surprise. His eyes were observant, careful, and his movements were slow in a way that signaled patience rather than hesitation. Grace stayed close to Rex as soon as she saw him, kneeling down to wrap both arms around his neck. Rex responded by shifting closer, placing his body between her and the hallway without blocking her view of Emma. Daniel watched all of it without moving. Sarah Whitmore appeared moments later, her hair now tied back tighter than the night before, dark circles more pronounced beneath her eyes. She carried a thin folder under one arm and a coffee she had clearly forgotten to drink in the other. She gave Daniel a brief nod before gesturing for him to follow her into a small conference room. The room held a rectangular table, 3 chairs, and a whiteboard covered with notes from previous cases that had been half erased and written over. Sarah closed the door gently behind them. Rex remained by Daniel's side, settling automatically. "We've finished the preliminary evaluations," Sarah said, taking a seat. "I want to be very clear about what we're seeing." Daniel nodded once. He had learned that clarity rarely softened what came next. Dr. Brooks spoke first, folding her hands together on the table. Emma presents with what we'd call adaptive control behavior, she said. She speaks quickly, answers before questions are finished, and positions herself physically between perceived threats and her sister. That's not defiance, it's protection. She's learned that being in control keeps them safer. Daniel thought of Emma standing in front of Grace inside the container, her small body tense but determined. She's not emotionally numb, Dr. Brooks continued. She's hyper-aware. If this continues unchecked, it can turn into anxiety or burnout later, but right now, it's her coping mechanism. Dr. Alvarez leaned forward slightly. Grace is different, he said. She exhibits classic trauma response indicators, selective mutism, physical clinging, heightened startle reflex. Her stress response decreases significantly in the presence of Rex. Daniel felt the familiar tightening behind his ribs. We ran controlled separations, Dr. Alvarez added, brief ones. Grace's heart rate spiked when Rex was removed. When he returned, her vitals stabilized within minutes. Sarah nodded, opening the folder. Based on these findings, the joint recommendation is clear. Separating the girls would carry a high risk of re-traumatization. Separating Grace from the dog would likely have the same effect. Daniel absorbed the words silently. The problem, Sarah continued, is placement. She let the sentence hang for a moment. Finding a foster home willing and able to take two siblings at once is already difficult, she said. Adding a retired military canine into that equation makes it nearly impossible. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained steady. So what happens? Sarah exhaled slowly. Under standard protocol, the system may recommend splitting them temporarily. One child placed immediately, the other following when resources become available. Emma shifted in her chair. We don't want that, she said sharply. Grace pressed closer to Rex. Dr. Brooks turned toward Emma, her tone gentle but firm. We know, she said. That's why we're looking at alternatives. Sarah's gaze returned to Daniel. One option is temporary guardianship. The word landed with unexpected weight. Daniel didn't answer immediately. It would mean the girls stay together, Sarah continued, and Rex stays with them. Daniel leaned back slightly. And the conditions? Sarah met his eyes without flinching. Background review, home assessment, a structured schedule, and stability. Daniel almost laughed at that, though no sound escaped him. There's something else, Sarah added quietly. You were flagged in the system this morning. Daniel's expression didn't change, but he felt it, the shift, the tightening of old instincts. You were offered a canine training contract, she said. Out of state, 6 months, high pay. Daniel's silence confirmed it. Dr. Alvarez glanced between them. That kind of stability, he said carefully, would normally strengthen a guardianship case. Daniel nodded once. It would. But, Sarah continued, it would require relocation and separation. Emma's breath hitched. Grace shook her head slowly, fingers tightening in Rex's fur. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. He saw it clearly. The offer letter he hadn't opened yet, the schedule that promised order, the chance to focus on work instead of memories. He also saw the freight container, the rain, the way Grace's breathing had slowed only when Rex stayed. There's more, Sarah said. Your medical file. Daniel opened his eyes. Your PTSD diagnosis, she said. It doesn't disqualify you, but it will be reviewed. So will your night shifts and irregular hours. Daniel's voice remained low and controlled. I manage. Sarah nodded. I know you do, but the system will ask whether that management is compatible with 2 traumatized children. Silence filled the room. For the first time since the war, Daniel felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with choice. In combat, decisions were immediate, clear. Here, there were no right answers, only consequences. Emma looked at him then, really looked at him, her guarded expression cracking just enough to show fear beneath the determination. Grace leaned fully into Rex, eyes closed, trusting without words. Daniel stood slowly. His movements were controlled, but something in his posture had changed, less rigid, more deliberate. "I didn't ask for this," he said quietly. "No one thinks you did," Sarah replied. Daniel looked down at Rex. The dog met his gaze, steady and unblinking. "But I won't be the reason they're split," Daniel said. Sarah inhaled sharply, then nodded. "We'll proceed with the guardianship evaluation," she said. "But you need to understand, this will change your life." Daniel already knew. For the first time since he'd left the Marines, the choice in front of him had nothing to do with survival. It had everything to do with responsibility. Daniel chose to stay in Greyhaven. The decision itself was quiet, almost anticlimactic. There was no dramatic phone call, no confrontation, no sense of relief when he declined the out-of-state K-9 training contract. He simply folded the offer letter, placed it back into its envelope, and slid it into a drawer he rarely opened. The house remained silent afterward, the same silence he had lived with for years, except now it carried weight. The house was small, a single-story rental near the edge of town, with creaking floorboards and walls that held cold in the mornings. It had never been meant for children. Daniel had chosen it years earlier because it was cheap, isolated, and predictable. Now it felt unfinished in a different way, as if the space itself was trying to adjust to the lives that had been placed inside it. Emma and Grace moved in under temporary guardianship 2 weeks later. The first night was the hardest. Grace woke just after midnight, her cry sharp and sudden, cutting through the house like broken glass. Daniel was on his feet before he fully understood what he was hearing, his body reacting the same way it always had, fast, precise, heart already pounding. Rex rose with him, nails clicking softly against the floor as they moved down the hallway together. Grace was sitting upright in bed, her small hands clawing at the blanket, breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Her dark hair clung to her damp forehead, eyes wide but unfocused, trapped somewhere Daniel couldn't reach. "It's okay," Daniel said, though the words felt inadequate. He crouched beside the bed, careful not to touch her too quickly. "You're safe." She didn't respond. Emma was awake too, already sitting up in the other bed, her face tight with concern. She slid off the mattress and stood beside her sister, placing herself just close enough to be seen without crowding. "It was the bad one," Emma said quietly, her voice too controlled for a child her age. "She always has it when it's quiet." Rex stepped forward without prompting and lay down beside Grace's bed, resting his head against the frame. Grace's hands found his fur almost immediately, fingers curling into it as if anchoring herself to something solid. Slowly, painfully slowly, her breathing began to steady. Daniel sat back on his heels, watching. He stayed there until morning. That became the pattern. Grace's nightmares came without warning, sometimes once a week, sometimes 3 nights in a row. Each time, Rex was there first, positioning himself beside her bed, body angled protectively toward the door. Daniel noticed how the dog always chose the same spot, how he never fully relaxed until Grace fell asleep again. It wasn't obedience, it was habit, forged in places where rest was conditional and vigilance kept people alive. Emma, meanwhile, grew quieter during the day. At school, her teachers described her as polite, focused, and unusually mature. She completed assignments quickly, corrected other students when they made mistakes, and rarely asked for help. At home, she watched Daniel closely, tracking his movements, learning his routines faster than he realized. She reminded Grace to eat, to brush her teeth, to bring her jacket. She spoke for her sister during therapy sessions unless gently redirected. Dr. Hannah Brooks noticed it immediately. "She's taking on a parental role," Dr. Brooks said during one of the early family therapy meetings. She sat across from Daniel in the clinic's softly lit office, legs crossed, hands resting loosely in her lap. Her tone was calm, clinical, but not detached. "It's understandable, but it's not sustainable." Daniel nodded, though he wasn't sure what to do with that information. "I don't know how to stop it," he said. Every time I try to step in, she looks like she's bracing for something to fall apart." "That's because she's learned that it does," Dr. Brooks replied gently. Family therapy was awkward at first. Daniel wasn't used to talking about feelings, especially not in rooms with pastel walls and boxes of tissues within reach. He sat stiffly in his chair, hands folded, answering questions carefully, offering facts instead of emotions. Grace stayed close to Rex, rarely speaking, while Emma answered eagerly but selectively, choosing words that painted stability even when it wasn't there. Over time, small shifts began to happen. Grace started speaking in single words during sessions. Not sentences, just responses. Yes. No. Rex. Dr. Miguel Alvarez praised every attempt without pushing further, his voice steady and patient, his presence grounding rather than intrusive. He understood trauma well enough to know that silence was not resistance, it was protection. Emma slowly began to falter. One afternoon, after school, she dropped her backpack by the door and sat on the floor, staring at nothing. Daniel noticed immediately. He knelt beside her, unsure of the correct distance. "What's wrong?" he asked. She shrugged. Then, without warning, she burst into tears. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet and exhausted, the sound of something finally giving way. Daniel froze, panic rising in his chest. This was not a situation he had trained for. Rex stood and moved closer, but Emma waved him away, pressing her face into her hands. "I don't want to be the big one anymore," she sobbed. "I'm tired." Daniel swallowed hard. He sat beside her and, after a brief hesitation, rested his hand on her back. She leaned into it instinctively. "You don't have to be," he said, his voice rough but steady. "That's my job." She didn't answer, but she stayed there, breathing slowly until the storm passed. Daniel learned parenting the way he learned everything else, through repetition, mistakes, and quiet observation. He learned how to pack lunches that didn't come back untouched. He learned the route to school, the names of teachers, the rhythm of pickup and drop-off. He learned how to sit through evaluations without becoming defensive, how to answer questions about his PTSD without minimizing it or letting it define him. The social worker assigned to monitor the placement, Karen Liu, visited once a week. She was in her late 30s, petite, with straight black hair cut just below her chin and an expression that revealed little. She spoke gently but took detailed notes, her eyes missing nothing. Daniel didn't like being observed, but he understood the necessity. "The house doesn't have to be perfect," Karen said during one visit, glancing around the living room where toys now sat beside old military books. "It just has to be consistent." Consistency was something Daniel understood. Evenings settled into routines. Dinner at the same time, homework at the same table. Rex stationed himself near the front door every night, lying with his back to the wall, facing the entrance. Daniel noticed it the third night and didn't correct it. Some habits served a purpose. There were no big victories, no sudden breakthroughs, no moments that felt like triumph. There were only small things, the way Grace slept longer each week, the way Emma asked for help once without being prompted, the way the house slowly began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a place that held people. Daniel lay awake many nights, listening to the quiet breathing from the girls' room, Rex's steady presence outside their door. He wondered often whether this life would last, whether the system would decide he wasn't enough. But every morning came anyway, and each day, imperfect as it was, kept moving forward. The courthouse in Greyhaven was quieter than Daniel expected. Not silent, there was still the low murmur of voices, the shuffle of paperwork, the distant echo of footsteps, but it lacked the tension he had imagined during the weeks leading up to this morning. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long, pale rectangles across the worn floor. Daniel sat on a wooden bench outside courtroom B, his posture composed but alert, hands resting loosely on his knees. Rex lay beside him, head up, ears relaxed, his presence steady and familiar. Emma and Grace sat close together on the bench to Daniel's left. Emma's feet barely touched the floor, her shoes swinging slightly as she tried to appear calm. She wore a simple blue sweater, her hair neatly brushed but imperfect, a few strands already escaping. Grace leaned into her sister's side, one small hand gripping Emma's sleeve, the other resting on Rex's back. She wore the same jacket she always chose on important days, the soft one that smelled like home now. Weeks of evaluations had led to this moment. Inside the courtroom, the process was methodical rather than dramatic. Files were referenced, reports summarized, observations read aloud in measured tones. Daniel listened without interruption as the judge, a middle-aged man with thinning gray hair and a face shaped by years of careful restraint, reviewed the case history. The judge's voice was even, detached, but not unkind. "The children have shown marked improvement," he said, glancing down at the documents before him. "Sleep patterns have stabilized. Academic engagement has increased. Emotional regulation, while still developing, is progressing within expected parameters given their history." Daniel felt his shoulders ease just slightly. Dr. Hannah Brooks testified briefly, her words precise and controlled. She described Emma's reduced need to control every situation, her growing willingness to defer responsibility. Dr. Miguel Alvarez followed, explaining Grace's gradual increase in verbal responses and her decreased reliance on constant physical reassurance, though he emphasized the continued importance of Rex's presence as a stabilizing factor. Sarah Whitmore spoke last for the county. She stood straight, hands clasped lightly in front of her, her light brown hair pulled back more neatly than usual. The fatigue was still there, etched into her posture, but there was something else now. Quiet confidence. "In my professional assessment," Sarah said, "the current placement has provided consistency, safety, and emotional continuity. Disrupting that environment at this stage would likely cause harm." The judge leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. The room fell quiet. Daniel did not look at Emma or Grace. He kept his gaze forward, steady, the way he had been trained to do in moments that mattered. Waiting had never been his strength, but he had learned how to endure it. After several long seconds, the judge spoke again. "The court approves an extension of temporary guardianship," he said. "This decision allows the children to remain together under Mr. Cole's care while long-term adoption pathways are explored." Emma inhaled sharply. Grace's grip tightened. Daniel closed his eyes for just a moment. "This ruling does not finalize adoption," the judge continued, "but it recognizes the stability of the current arrangement and its benefit to the children involved." The gavel came down once, solid, final. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. Emma walked a few steps ahead, then turned back suddenly, uncertainty flashing across her face. "So, we're staying?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral, as if bracing for disappointment even now. Daniel nodded. "Yes." She didn't smile right away. Instead, she stepped closer to Grace and wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Grace leaned into the embrace without hesitation, her face pressing into Emma's side. Rex stood and positioned himself beside them, tail giving a single, slow wag. Sarah approached Daniel near the courthouse steps. "You did well," she said quietly. "I just stayed," Daniel replied. Sarah smiled faintly. "That's more than most people manage." Life did not transform overnight. The days that followed looked much like the ones before them. School mornings, therapy appointments, grocery runs, quiet dinners. But something subtle had shifted. The sense of impermanence that had hung over the house began to fade, replaced by something sturdier, something that didn't feel like it would disappear if touched too hard. Emma began asking questions about the future, small ones at first, whether she could join a school club, whether they could plant something in the yard. Grace started bringing her drawings home from therapy, placing them carefully on the kitchen table as if they were important documents. Daniel made space for all of it. He adjusted his work hours where he could, took fewer night contracts, learned which battles to fight and which to let pass. He didn't try to be perfect. He focused on being present. That evening, the house settled into quiet earlier than usual. Emma and Grace asked to sleep in the same bed, something they hadn't done in weeks. Daniel agreed without hesitation. He tucked them in, pulling the blanket up carefully, making sure their shoulders were warm. Emma lay on her side, facing Grace, one hand resting protectively on her sister's arm. Grace slept almost immediately, her breathing slow and even. Rex lay down in the doorway, his body stretched across the threshold the way he always chose at night. Not tense, not rigid, just there. Daniel turned off the light and stepped back into the hallway. He carried a mug of coffee out onto the small front porch and sat down in the old wooden chair he had repaired himself months ago. The night was calm, the air cool but not cold. Somewhere in the distance, the forest rustled softly, alive but not threatening. For years, Daniel had lived as if the world required constant vigilance, as if rest was a luxury he hadn't earned. Tonight, for the first time, he let his shoulders relax fully. Inside the house, 2 children slept peacefully. A dog kept watch out of habit, not fear. And Daniel sat still, not guarding the night, not preparing for what might come next, just being there. There was no miracle. Only the quiet result of choosing the right thing again and again until it became a life. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or light from the sky. Sometimes, they come quietly, through ordinary people who choose to stay when walking away would be easier. Perhaps that is how God works most often, not by changing the world in a single moment, but by placing small choices in our hands and asking what we will do with them. In everyday life, we may never face decisions as dramatic as Daniel's, but we are all given moments where kindness, patience, and responsibility matter more than comfort or convenience. And when we choose love again and again, we may discover that healing follows, one day at a time. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who might need hope tonight. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from and which part of the story stayed with you. And if you believe in stories that restore faith in humanity, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue sharing them together. May God bless you and your loved ones, protect you through every season of life, and remind you that even in quiet moments, His presence is never far.